Hi, welcome everybody. Welcome to the Lunch and Learn on Drupal 7 End of Life, an overview of your options. I'm going to be running through my slides a little quicker than usual this time. I've done several Lunch and Learns that kind of didn't leave as much time for Q&A as I would like. So I'm going to try and just rush through the slides and open it up for Q&A at the end. And I'm going to make sure that everybody also has a copy of the link to the slides, because some of the resources that I used, some of these URLs are very long and they didn't actually fit on the slide. So what I did was I put a little anchor text on the slide and I linked it. So there are a lot of active links to my research and my sort of footnotes that are in the slides that you might want to check out later. So if you get a copy of the slides later, you can go through and anything that you want to follow up on. If it's in blue, you should be able to follow that link to whatever I looked at when I was researching this. So, Drupal 7, End of Life, an overview of your options. Here we go. Here's a table of contents. Drupal 7's ending. You got to rebuild one way or another. You can't just really upgrade in place, although you may have one option in that regard, but mostly you have to rebuild. You're either going to rebuild in Drupal 9, rebuild in some other content management system or some other framework, or actually export your HTML and CSS and images and such to a static site to archive it. The other option that we're going to get into a little bit is if you really, really love Drupal 7 and you want to stick with it, even after the end of life and after the support ceases, there is something called Backdrop CMS, which is a fork of Drupal 7. So that's another interesting option if you really are married to Drupal 7. And then I'm going to give you some tips for migration, and I'm going to open it up to questions and answers. Drupal 7 end of life. We hardly knew ye. Drupal 7's been around for a really long time. and in fact, we thought it was going to end before it was announced back in September 12th, 2018. Dries announced on his blog that Drupal 7 was going to end in November 2021, the same last month, same as Drupal 8. They were both supposed to go off the cliff at the same time. And what they found over the course of that year was that, well, first of all, upgrading from Drupal 8 to Drupal 9 was much easier than upgrading from Drupal 7 to Drupal 9. So, a lot of organizations were able to upgrade their Drupal 8 sites to Drupal 9 on time for the end of life. And I'm sure there are a few stragglers, but by and large, people have been able to do it. But with Drupal 7, not so much. There are still a lot of organizations, a lot of Drupal 7 sites out there in the wild. It was incredibly popular compared to any other version of Drupal that had ever come before. It really was an immense explosion in usage of Drupal when Drupal 7 came out. And a lot of organizations are still using it. So the other thing, as we know, that happened in the past couple of years was the COVID-19 pandemic, and that's been just terrible economic impact and caused a lot of disruption to a lot of businesses, a lot of organizations, that a lot of the same, whether it's government or nonprofit or education or small businesses or different, a lot of people, a lot of different organizations use Drupal, and we've all in the past couple of years been impacted to whatever degree by the pandemic. So in November of 2022, they extended the end of, or rather last month, they extended the end of life to November of 2022. So you get one extra year to upgrade your site from Drupal 7 to whatever you're going to use. And also they extended the window for the vendor extended support. So this is a long-term support program similar to the one that is currently still in place for Drupal 6. And hopefully none of you are stuck on a Drupal 6 site, but if you are, there are options that that you can pay for long-term support, the same sort of security updates and things, and the same sort of support that used to be free because it was an open source project. Now you have to enter into a support contract with an approved vendor. And essentially the same thing's going to happen for Drupal 7. When it does reach its end of life, vendors will need to apply for it. They need to pay thousands of dollars a year for the right to be listed as an approved vendor, and they need to be approved by the Drupal security team. And there are various requirements. You have to have a member of your organization who's actually on the security team. You need to be actively contributing to issue queues for Drupal 7 core and contributed modules. And they're going to evaluate these organizations and make sure that that indeed they are prepared to offer extended support. All of these links, by the way, I'm just going to mouse over it if you guys can see the finger. Everything in blue on here, these link to the original. This is the original announcement from September 12th, 2018. This is the extension for the COVID-19 pandemic. And this is a little bit about the vendor extended support program, which, I can show you if these things, if I open them in a new tab. Actually, I have to, I'm not going to do it. It goes into a new tab like that. Here we go. This is for organizations that are interested in providing commercial Drupal 7 vendor extended support. That's probably not why you're here. It's not the topic of the conversation, but I did link to that instead of this because the actual page about Drupal 7 extended support program doesn't have a lot of content on it yet. It just says this page will be updated with detailed information as we get closer to the Drupal 7 end of life in November of 2022. So, but you can see down at the bottom of this page, there are already a few: Acquia, obviously, Lullabot, some of the usual suspects, and My Drop Wizard. These are the people who are kind of the leaders of the Drupal 6 extended support, long-term support initiative. So, and if you've got an agency that's really, really into Drupal 7, you might be interested in the extended support program in that way as well. But this is just to give you, an overview of your options. If you do end up stuck on Drupal 7 for a little while, you do have one option is maybe you don't upgrade and you pay an approved vendor for extended support for your Drupal 7 sites. That is one option. It's not necessarily the one I recommend, but I recommend that you rebuild your site. And I actually recommend that if you needed to have a Drupal site in the first place, that you take it all the way to Drupal 9 and just in one go. And the way that it works is you have to rebuild before migrating. No option exists for an in-place upgrade directly from Drupal 7 to Drupal 8 or 9. You have to rebuild a clean Drupal 9 site at this point, and you need to rebuild whatever configuration and content entities that need to exist in your Drupal 9 site as the sort of migration target. And then you can go and migrate those things out of the Drupal 7 database and into the Drupal 9 database. So there are three major phases. There's a discovery phase. You need to go back to your production site and document the data model and the information architecture. Figure out what code is custom that your team wrote for your site that's your custom business logic and your own custom modules, or sometimes in your theme, if you have a lot of theme preprocess or different logic implemented in your theme layer. And you need to decide what contributed modules you rely on to provide essential functionality for your site. And you need to determine whether they're available for Drupal 9, or maybe they went out the door with Drupal 7 and you can't get them anymore, in which case you're going to need to roll your own solution or find like another way of providing that. If there is another alternate contrib module, for example, that does a similar thing to the one that you can't get from Drupal 7 anymore. And then you're going to decide what content you want to migrate and what content you want to leave behind. And this is actually probably the biggest place where you can save money because migrating the content is complicated and expensive. And when you first encounter the whole process, you may be a little bit taken aback. I know, a lot of people, a lot of organizations were when this was first announced that Drupal 7 was going to reach its end of life and that they were going to upgrade to Drupal 8. It seems like a very complex process and a time-consuming process and potentially an expensive process. And it is, there's no sugarcoating that, but as we'll see by the time we get to the end of this, it's not necessarily any more expensive than a clean rebuild in some other WordPress or some other CMS or, you know, Symfony or Laravel or some other MVC. So you may find that actually rebuilding in Drupal 9 is the best option. But after the discovery phase, once you've sort of determined what you need to migrate, then you're going to rebuild the site in Drupal 9. You recreate the configuring content entities. You install Drupal 9 versions of any contrib modules and themes if they're available. And if they're not available, you choose alternatives. And then you can run your migration. And we'll get a little bit deeper into the Migrate API as we go along. But it's not the only focus of this talk. So we're going to do a more of an overview rather than an in-depth look at any particular solution. Now, just as if any of you saw my previous, I did a lunch and learn about upgrading Drupal 8 to Drupal 9. That was the most recent one that I've done a couple of times. And some of these same tools that are helpful for the Drupal 7 to 9 migration are the same tools or the Drupal 7 version of the same tools that I used in Drupal 8. So they were already in my previous lunch and learn. But essentially, you've got the upgrade status module, which you use the Drupal, oh gosh, let me go back. Use the Drupal 7 version to check and see if your modules and themes have Drupal 9 versions. And we'll open that in a new tab and I'll show you the project page. Upgrade status. This is the same thing I showed in my other lunch and learn. It's really a lovely effort. It tells you what's compatible with Drupal 9. Oh no, we're only at 15% so far, you know. What's incompatible? Is it your actual hosting environment? Maybe you need a newer version of PHP, or you need a different version of Apache or MySQL. And maybe you want to make sure that you're on the very latest version of whatever Drupal you're upgrading from. So if you've got an old Drupal 7 site, make sure it's at the very newest version, you know. And then it's going to run this awesome little report of what things you should remove, what things you should update, what things need to be scanned, or you may have different blockers and different things that you'll end up going back to the issue queues and looking at patches and all the stuff that my previous lunch and learn was about. So we're not getting too deep into it here. You can go and look at the one that was for Drupal 8 to Drupal 9, and a lot of the same concepts apply. That's the same upgrade status module. There's also a Drupal module upgrader, which I didn't talk about that in context of Drupal 8 to Drupal 9 because it's not necessary. The APIs are largely the same from Drupal 8 to Drupal 9. There are deprecations and things that are a little bit, you know, finessed, but it's not like a massive breakage like we're encountering here. If you're upgrading from Drupal 6 or 7 directly to 9, you're going to have a lot of breakage and a lot of completely different approaches and completely different APIs. And this is what this Drupal module upgrader, now it says the video is unavailable. We're not going to watch the video. And this is the project page, and it's got a lot of good information. But essentially, this is something that it's going to look at your Drupal 7 custom module code, and it's going to suggest what you might want to do to bring it into the new world of the Drupal 8 and 9 compatible APIs. So, and it says here, you know, the existing transformation should be Drupal 9 compatible. This is all of this documentation was written before Drupal 8's end of life. So, you know, a lot of the places where it says that something is good for Drupal 8, just think of it as Drupal 8 plus. Drupal 8, Drupal 9, Drupal 10, they're all Drupal 8 plus now. They all use, they're built on the same foundation of the Symfony APIs and all the new approaches that they made when they changed from 7 to 8. Those are going to be the same going forward. So these are great tools. And again, when you get the slides, you can click on the links. You can easily follow that. There's also deprecation checking tools, which we also talked about this in context of Drupal 8 to Drupal 9. But if you're familiar with the concept of code deprecations, right? Like Drupal 7 uses a lot of APIs that they're out of style. They're old school. They don't work anymore in the new Drupal 8, Drupal 9 world. So you can use an IDE that understands deprecations. You can configure an IDE like PHP Storm to understand that your target is a Drupal 9 site and that anything that won't run on there, they'll cross out the calls to deprecated methods and they'll inform you of what should be used instead. And that's very helpful if you're in there writing the code. You can also use Drupal check for deprecation testing, and I'll show you that in a new tab. This is our esteemed colleague, Matt Glamman, who is very, very active in this sort of migration and upgrading and seeking and destroying the deprecations kind of effort. He's really one of the people at the forefront of that right now. And this is his GitHub repo for the Drupal check tool, which is built on top of something called PHP Stan for static analysis. I talked more about that in my last thing, so I'm not going to go in depth about it here. There's also Rector, which Palantir has taken over this project. That's a company that's working on this project to automate fixing deprecated Drupal code. So if you find a contrib module that does that, it probably is using Rector under the hood, and specifically this upgrade Rector project. This is a module similar to the upgrade status module. In fact, they're closely integrated, the two modules. You can use them both, as I said in my last Lunch and Learn, when you're going from 8 to 9. You can also use them to help you ease your road ahead when you're going from 7 directly to 9. And it will do stuff like, oh, wow, this is, you know, Drupal set message. I can't highlight this as a picture, but oh, Drupal set message is no good. I'm going to call Drupal messenger and the add status method. And this is how, you know, we do it now. A lot of the time, these things are very simple substitutions. You'll recognize the same patterns over and over again, things that were done the old way, things that were done the new way. You get familiar with it and it won't be that scary anymore, but there's a lot of it. This is where the automated tools can really be helpful. What else have we got? The Migrate API and how to customize it, right? You can customize it working with the Migrate API, and you can do custom migrations without the Migrate API. Let's take a quick look at that. Basic migration concepts. You've got configuration entities and content entities in Drupal 8+. They're different than how they were in Drupal 7, Drupal 6, and earlier. So you're going to need to take all of the entities. They don't just, you can't just take them out of the database and put them in the other database. They're different. So just to give you an idea, I put these next to each other, and I'm going to use the pointer, but what's config, what's content? In Drupal, it's a little confusing at first. You got to wrap your head around it. Anything that you do to set up a container for people to put the stuff in. So anything that's configuring entities and fields and creating an interface between what people are pointing and clicking on when they're content editor and they're typing in WYSIWYG fields or in text fields or uploading images or media entities or whatever. And then on the other end of that API, there's a database schema, right? So the configuration tells Drupal how to store all this stuff in the database. And the content is what we put into that container that we've created and defined with the schema, with the configuration schema. So essentially, config entity, it could be block placement, but a content entity could be the contents of a custom block. User roles are configuration, but users are content. You know, a user is an entity type. It's just a collection of fields, really like an article or something else. And when you actually enter, my name is Matt Obert, this is my email address, and I'm making an account for myself, all of those things go into the field. They're content, just like an article or whatever. That's an entity. That's a content entity. taxonomy vocabularies, the structure of your taxonomy, that's configuration. Taxonomy items, the actual taxonomy terms in the vocabulary, each one is content. Same thing with menus. The overall structure of the menu is defined by configuration, but the content of an actual menu link that, oh, I'm going to have this word, when you click on it, it's going to go to this path, that is content. And last of all, I'll talk about content types, because you can define your own custom content types in Drupal, and field definitions, right? The entity API and the field API, that allows you to customize your content type, say what fields you want in it and all that stuff. The field definitions, the widgets, all that stuff, config entity. What you actually put in that content type after you've created it and your content editors come into your site and they start making articles or whatever your content type may be, that is content. So the two things are different. The main difference is that the configuration can be exported and imported and managed using the Drupal 8 plus configuration management and YAML files. So hopefully you got some idea what part of your Drupal 7 site is configuration and what part is content. And all of those things are going to have to be painstakingly recreated in whatever the target site is. I mean, you would have to do the exact same thing if you did it for migrating from Drupal 7 to WordPress. But if you do it with Drupal 9, you've got this Migrate API, which is very stable, very mature, very full featured, and gives you a lot of flexibility in how you import things. There's a lot just included in Drupal core, and there is so much more, as we'll see in just a moment, in the contributed software space. So these are Drupal core migrate modules. They're shipped with Drupal core, but they're disabled by default. Now, of course, you can enable them with Drush, like Drush en migrate. That will turn it on if you use Drush. And I hope we all, if we're Drupal developers, I hope we all use Drush. You will definitely have an easier time working with the Migrate API if you're able to use Drush to run your migrations and roll them back. And there are various Drush commands for that. But here in the screenshot, I've showed essentially how, if you go through the Drupal UI to enable it, if you don't use Drush, then you go to the extend page where it lists all your modules. And you'll see here, I searched for the word migrate. It says, oh, enter a part of the module name or description. I put in migrate, and here are the migration modules that are included in Drupal core. There's the migrate module. You'll see I just checked all three of these little blue check boxes, like, yes, please enable these modules. They are included in core, but they are not in use yet. I'm going to enable them now, and you will need them all. I recommend that you use them all. Theoretically, you don't need the user interface, the last one. You could just use the API and the migrate Drupal and use your own custom migrations and Drush commands. You don't necessarily need the user interface, but it's nice to have the user interface. And this is analogous to, for example, views is in Drupal core, and you can run views with or without the views UI. And that just gives you an interface that you can point and click on and use within the Drupal management interface. So migrate itself, the migrate module, provides the underlying API, the migrate API, and that's used by all these other modules. The migration source may be Drupal 6 or 7, or it may be a different system altogether. Then the Migrate Drupal module is the one that actually has the capabilities needed to migrate configuration and content entities from Drupal 6 or 7 to Drupal 8 or 9 or later. And then the user interface, as I say, you go to /upgrade. It's just it's another admin configuration form, essentially. It's a page on your site that you can go to change the settings and actually run the migrations and configure it from there. There are a ton of contributed migrate modules. I'm not going to talk about all of these. You can see at a glance that, well, I'll tell you, migrate upgrade and migrate tools provide drush commands that will be very useful. So I recommend installing both of those. Migrate Plus also extends the Migrate API in myriad ways, and I recommend that one very, very strongly. There's one called Migrate Views. Views changed a lot between Drupal 7 and Drupal 8, and you cannot just migrate your views. You need to rebuild the views in Drupal 9, right? We're talking 9 now, 8 plus 9. You need to rebuild the views, but this Migrate Views module does a pretty good effort to automate that process. But if you have a lot of views, if you have very complex views, don't rely on this. You can expect breakage in views. It's very different. And this is a good faith effort to automate the process, but it's not foolproof. Other things, WordPress migrate. It's exactly what it sounds like. If your source database is coming from a WordPress site and you're migrating that into Drupal 8 plus, into your new Drupal 9 site, this is what the WordPress migrate tool is for. Again, I got the list from here, Drupal.org docs, upgrading Drupal, and here are some modules in core and contrib. Each one of these is a link to its project page on Drupal.org. I'm not going to show them all to you now. It'd take all day. You get the slides. You can click on them yourself and read all about them. There's a lot of good stuff here. Now you can customize your migration in two ways. You can do it by working within the Drupal Migrate API, which is the recommended solution, or by working outside of the Drupal Migrate API, which is the sort of old school Wild West cowboy solution. And that indeed is very common among people that are more familiar with older versions of Drupal, when you might just write a custom module that's going to, that's the next step. This one first, I'm going to talk about the working with the Migrate API on this slide. This here, customized migrations, that's the link. Links are so darn long, I couldn't even have the URL on the slide. So that's why you got to click on the link on the slide. And essentially this is, if you go to that page, I have summarized it here, but essentially it tells you how to create initial migrations, export configuration. You've got all these YAML files, moving from here to there. You're doing these different things. You're editing YAML files. You're gonna, migration management, essentially you want to make sure you migrate user roles and then users, and then you start to worry about your custom content types, your nodes and stuff. You can rename fields. That's not in Drupal core. You need to install the Migrate Plus contrib module to change what your source field and your destination field. You can write custom process plugins, which you can do a couple of ways. You can write PHP code to write a custom process plugin, or you can modify migration plugins as configuration entities, which means you're just editing the YAML. But essentially a custom, what's a process plugin? That's like, if this, then that. So rather than just saying, okay, I've got my content type, it's articles. I'm going to get the title from Drupal 7. I'm going to stick it in the title field in Drupal 9. I'm going to get the body from Drupal 7 database, stick it in the body field in the Drupal 9 database, and just correspond, each thing lines up with another one and you just dump it over. Process plugins say, oh, if the title field is foo, then I'm going to treat that one differently. And there's no limit to what you can do with it. It's very, very fine-grained and nuanced. There's also alter hooks. So if you're familiar with Drupal and you've got a Drupal 7 site, I assume all of you who are interested in this topic have been working with Drupal 7. So you must know about, hook, alter. There are a couple of alter hooks exposed to you in the Migrate API. So you can prepare a row essentially of items that you're pulling out of the old database, and you can munge it a little bit before you put it in the next in the target database. There's also hook migration plugins alter, and that's another way that you can get into the existing migration plugins and you can tweak what they do en route. So all of this can be done in your own custom code. And if you're writing a custom module that leverages the Migrate API, you also have access to all of these events. It's a big list. I'm not going to read them all out loud. You can read it. It's on the slide. But essentially, when one of these things happens, post import or post rollback, wow, okay, I just rolled back my migration and now I want to run this stuff to clean up. Or I just imported from Drupal 7 to Drupal 9 and now run this logic to do something after that. So all of these they're not hooks. The other ones are hooks. All these events are also available to you in your custom PHP code. Then I called this custom migration shortcuts. And, this is maybe how we all used to do it back in the old days of Drupal and the old days of PHP, and you might be familiar with just taking maybe something from a comma separated value list and sticking it into SQL, or I don't recommend that you do that with Drupal entities because the way the entity API works. I do recommend that if you're going to create entities in Drupal coming in from an import and you're not using the Migrate API, I recommend using the entity API for the import. So you're going to get the values any which way you get them, any crazy PHP tricks you can do. Database API, reading directly from the old Drupal 7 database, or, SQL to CSV import. Maybe on your Drupal 7 site, creating a view that puts out an RSS feed and then using the contributed modules, feeds and feeds tamper to read that RSS feed and do something with it. These are all different things you can do. They're all different tricks that you can do if you're not doing a huge migration that you need to run and roll back many times, maybe you don't need the full power and flexibility and awesomeness of the Migrate API. And maybe you can get by, as I have seen in the wild. Sometimes maybe the only thing you're going to migrate is the users. And in that case, I've seen people just scrape the user data from a Drupal 7 database and use, with Drupal 9, you would use like entity type manager to create those users with the values that you got from your old source database. That is certainly a possible approach. Generally not recommended, may be appropriate for small or partial migrations. And another one that's on this list here is web scrapers. That's another way that you can get content from an old site. You don't necessarily need to do that if you're going from Drupal 7 to Drupal 9 because you've got the Migrate API. But if you're coming from some other thing into Drupal 9, you might find a web scraper to be a valuable tool where you're actually pulling just the HTML and Python beautiful soup or something, and then just analyzing it and using that to create some kind of importable artifact that you can then use with, at the end would be the entity API to create these entities. Again, I'm not going to spend too much time on this. I don't recommend this. I do want to flag it as a potential option because you will encounter this sometimes. If you take over a site that someone else was in the process of migrating, sometimes people don't want to learn the Migrate API. It seems too big, it seems too daunting, and they want to stick with what's comfortable and familiar. So you will see these techniques used in the wild. So that's why I made a whole slide about the custom migration shortcut approach. Here's a very interesting one. Hopefully I'm right on track with my timing here. But Backdrop CMS is a stable and mature fork of Drupal 7. I should have looked back in its history to see how long it's been around, but I've been hearing about it for many years, like probably at least a decade now. And it's really interesting because it's similar to Drupal 7, but not the same. When you come to this slide, after you access the slides, obviously this is backdropcms.org. That's their website, which is the screenshot over here. But also here where it says not the same in blue, if you click on that, it'll go to a section of the Backdrop API documentation where it breaks down exactly what they've changed from Drupal 7, what things are the same, what things are different. Many modules have been removed from Drupal 7 core. And it's no surprise. The same darn thing happened when they made Drupal 8, right? There was just too much bloat in core that could have been in contrib or could have been done another way. And I think you'll find if you click on that link, many modules have been removed from core. You know, a lot of the same things were the same ones that you don't have in Drupal 8 or 9 core anymore. That have either moved to the contrib space or they're done some other way. But Backdrop has a very active community, so it's different from Drupal 7, but they have a lot of people working on it, and they all came from the Drupal 7 development world, and they're familiar with Drupal 7 APIs, and they have their favorite Drupal 7 features and modules and stuff. And by and large, the best ones that they like the most, they have already ported to Backdrop. So there are 70 plus Drupal 7 modules included in Backdrop core. 94% of the top 100 Drupal 7 modules have already been ported to Backdrop. And if your project, your Drupal 7 project, needs a module or a theme that hasn't been ported, you can port it yourself. And this link actually goes to a very interesting YouTube video where somebody goes to a pretty simple Drupal 7 module. It's the external link module. You may be familiar with EXTLINK, external link. It's basically a JavaScript library that determines whether the links on your site are internal links within your site or whether they take you off site. And if they're off-site links, it's going to put up a little icon that warns you you're about to go off. And optionally, it can put up a little pop-up message that says, you're about to leave the site. Are you okay with this? And it may also, you know, if it's a mail to link, it may show you a little envelope instead of a square with an arrow jumping off. You're going out of the site, or no, you're sending someone a mail. So external link, super simple module. And this YouTube video, the guy spends all of 5 minutes getting it to run in Backdrop, and then maybe another 5 minutes getting it to work with the configuration management. And I think now that I notice, I skipped this line, but Backdrop has built-in configuration management similar to Drupal 8, but different. So unlike Drupal 8, which uses YAML files for its configuration management, Backdrop exports your configuration to JSON files, JavaScript object notation. So it's very similar concept. And in practice, it's much the same thing. You can export configurations from one site and import them in another. You can export them from your local and import them on dev, or you can export them from dev and import them on stage. And you can send that all the way to a production environment that way. Similar to Drupal 8 or 9, different implementation. So when you actually are working with modules, you'll have to learn the new Backdrop APIs for things like the configuration management. And that way your Drupal 7 module will work with Backdrop and with all of its new goodness that makes it kind of like a little bit of a hybrid between Drupal 7 and Drupal 8. But there are differences. So it's not like necessarily one and done, but a lot of the things have already been ported. So you'll go through the same, if you do want to go to Backdrop, you'll go through the same process of discovery, and you kind of may be able to somewhat skip the rebuild process because there is a built-in upgrade path directly from Drupal 7 to Backdrop. What you do is you make a local copy of your Drupal 7 site, upgrade it as much as possible to the very latest version of Drupal 7, remove any unsupported features that you know are not going to be supported in Backdrop. So you've got to do some research before you start, but it's not too onerous. Also remove any content that you don't want to migrate, because it's the perfect time to get rid of it, especially if it's going to cause a problem if you migrate it and Backdrop's not ready for it, right? Get rid of the stuff that you don't want to migrate. And then you actually switch the code, and then you run update PHP, which is the same thing that Drupal 7 uses to apply like a hook update N to change database schemas and stuff like that. that's the mechanism. In fact, if any of you are old timers and you remember upgrading, for example, from Drupal 6 to 7, that's how you did it. It was sort of, things back then were less of a Git centric and composer managed kind of PHP project. And they were more of coming out of the history of, oh, this is just like, I've got something on my local computer. I've got like an FTP program that puts it on a server. Maybe FileZilla or something like that, and if you're used to that method, this is certainly going to be very familiar to you. You're going to take your existing Drupal 7 site and you're going to just clobber some files or delete some files and replace them with the backdrop equivalent of, you're going to change the whole structure of the site in place. And hopefully, you do it now, at least you'll commit it to Git, right? And when you do that, then you're still going to be able to connect to the same database. You're going to go to the update PHP script and run that, and it's going to completely change everything that needs to be changed in the database and make your old content compatible with Backdrop. So it kind of is an in-place upgrade, which you can't really do if you're going from Drupal 7 to 9 or from Drupal to something else entirely like WordPress or whatever else. So Backdrop, I'll just say this before I move on. Backdrop is a very appealing option for people that are absolutely married to Drupal 7. Their organization loves Drupal 7. They know it well. They have Drupal 7 developers who really understand how to do custom modules. They understand the Drupal 7 APIs very well. Backdrop can be a compelling option for these organizations because it is sort of an in-place upgrade. It's a little bit less complex, but it's not the same as Drupal. It's a different community. It's a smaller community. Although I predict that as Drupal 7 reaches end of life, the Backdrop community may grow quite a lot this year. So it has a lot going for it. But it's not Drupal. It's something different, and you're going to have different costs to managing that, different technical debt that you bring along to managing that. Just not better or worse, but different. So in some ways, it might be an easier migration from Drupal 7 directly to Backdrop, but you may end up. It depends. It depends on what your site has to do and whether or not it really needed to be. Like, does it really need to be a Drupal 9 site, or can it be Backdrop? You have to do the research, and that'll all be part of your discovery phase. So let's talk about rebuilding in other CMS frameworks. I just threw this big old list at the wall. I'm not even going to read it out loud. I got it off of this link up here from Wikipedia, and I did not even copy all of the content management systems out of that link. It's a huge table. Some of them I'm actually familiar with. I mean, obviously, we all know WordPress. We've heard of Magento, Expression Engine, perhaps, Joomla. It's a favorite punching bag of the Drupal developer community to make fun of Joomla, but it exists. It's out there, and it's appropriate for some sites. I used text pattern for a couple of sites. I'm familiar with that one. It's an XSLT transform based PHP. You make your own custom tags for it. It's very interesting. There are so many options here, and your mileage may vary. You need to figure out in your discovery phase, does my site need to be Drupal? Do I need the flexibility of Drupal? Do I need Drupal's approach to information architecture and the way that you can make so easily with the field API and the entity API, make these bundles of fields that are custom entity types, and also all of the different APIs that you can use in your own custom modules and the whole galaxy of contributed modules. And if you need all that stuff or some of that stuff in your site, then you probably want to stick with Drupal. But there are so many other options out there. And indeed, you could even rebuild in another framework that isn't even on the list of CMSs, right? You could go right to the source code and use something like Symfony, which is part of Drupal, but you could use just plain Symfony and build the rest of it yourself. You could use Laravel. It's very popular, also built somewhat on Symfony. It's a different direction to take it. Then Drupal took it in one direction, Laravel took it in another direction. But there are so many other great options. I mean, Python, Django, Flask. I mean, all these things are great. There are JavaScript frameworks that are amazing that are, now with Node and Angular, React, Vue. All of these things are potential contenders. It depends on what your content is and how you want to present it and what you need in terms of user interface for your content creators. Or, I mean, some of these things like even are based on the other CMSs. That one Blossom, that weird one that was written in Perl, that runs off of flat files. It doesn't even use a database. You just put text files in a Git repo and you push them somewhere, and this Perl script makes that into your HTML. So there are so many different options. I'm not going to get into any of these. You're welcome to research them on your own. Again, this is just a link to a massive list of names of projects, and it contains the links to all those projects. You can decide whether your Drupal site would be happier in Spring Boot MVC or Ruby on Rails. But I actually think, and before I move on from this, that the amount of time and money and effort that is needed to take your Drupal 7 site and move it to Drupal 9, while initially daunting and off-putting, is probably less in most cases than what it will take for you to rebuild your entire site and migrate it to another platform entirely without the benefit of the Migrate API, which exists in Drupal 9. It's stable, it's mature, it's well documented, and has a ton of community contributed modules to enhance it, and APIs that you can use in your own custom code to further customize it. So you can certainly consider some of these other things, but I don't think if the call to moving your Drupal 7 site to WordPress instead of Drupal is that you think you'll save money, I'm not certain about that. It depends on the site. Certainly smaller sites that are like a brochureware site that just have basic pages, why, you could take that out of Drupal 7 and rebuild it in anything, and it'll be cheaper than if your site actually leverages the full capacities of Drupal 7, which, custom content types, custom modules, a lot of things, even just views, contrib modules, a lot of the things that you may have used when you initially built that Drupal 7 site. So if your site, you need to, in your discovery phase, you need to determine, first of all, whether it needs to be a Drupal site. Did it need to be a Drupal site in the first place? Can we just rebuild it more simply in some other, it's some other platform or framework? It's certainly a possibility, but I think that as the complexity of your site increases, you'll find that if it needed to be a Drupal 7 site in the first place, you'd probably be happiest migrating it to Drupal 9. Now, in some cases, you just won't be able to afford the migration at all. If you have too many sites that are, like, some organizations have hundreds of Drupal 7 sites and they just can't migrate them all in time for the deadline. And some of them are looking at this next option, which normally you would only use for something that changes very infrequently or not at all. But that's a static site export to an archive. So static site export is something that we've been doing, off here in the sidebar, you're seeing, downloading an entire website with wget, right? This software is old. This is an old Unix command line utility that's probably 25 years old, at least at this point. I've been using it for at least 20 years. And it's like an amazing web vacuum cleaner you point it at a website. You can say, okay, get me everything at this URL, everything that's linked to from the HTML on this URL, including images and CSS and other assets that, JavaScript in some cases can be migrated this way, as long as it's just like a static asset of JavaScript, right? And all of these things can just be migrated. Like, you can export it directly from a website that's online and just put it all in a folder, and it'll be just static HTML that you can then host on any web server, like with minimal modification. And this is like a very long sort of incantation here, because it has a lot of different options passed to it. Recursive to download the entire website. Domains, website.org, don't follow links outside of website.org. No parent, that's if your initial path is further down below the domain, down a path, don't follow links outside of that path. So you can get just a section of a site. It's pretty amazing. It's an old, well-known tool. There's also this one, HT Track. I may as well show that. This is a Windows app, right? It's like with a graphical user interface that does the same thing as that wget thing does. But actually, it also has a Linux, Unix, BSD release. And I believe that might even work on Mac OS, because that essentially is a BSD Unix, though it may be an X window app and you may need to do a couple of extra steps to get that running. You've already got Xcode installed and all of this stuff, and you've got Homebrew, and if you're a Drupal developer, so you can probably figure that out if you want to use HT Track instead. I haven't used it, but it looks really cool if you prefer pointing and clicking on different menus rather than typing a command and including different options and flags. There's also Drupal's. I have used Drupal 8 to export a static site. I worked on the Drupal Camp New York City site with JD Leonard, and we, at the end of the event, right, every year, you take that old site and you export it to static HTML so that you can archive it, because the event is over. The things that happened are in the past and will no longer change, but we want to keep it around as an archive that people can refer to the archive of what happened, right? So I used a cool module called Tome. I could talk about that. I could do a whole session on how cool Tome is, but it's not available for Drupal 7, so it's not an option. D7 has other options. I found a few just Googling around. There's one called Static Generator, which is linked from here. One called Boost, which seems to be the most popular, and one called Zeriz. I found those three. I think there was another one. And, each one's got its own project page. They tell you how to dump the thing. I mean, look at this one. 176 sites use the static module. It's not the most popular. Zeriz doesn't even say how many. I'm not sure what's up with that. Neither one of those is covered by the security advisory policy, but you don't really care, right? Because what you're doing is exporting your Drupal 7 site and taking it offline potentially forever. So all you need to do is get the static HTML, and that in and of itself as a target is going to be secure. Nobody can really hack. There's a limit to what damage you can do if you hack a static site. There's no SQL injection attacks on a static site. This other one, Boost, seems to be far and away the most popular one, and it has a bunch of submodules that deal with a bunch of different things. And if you notice, 14,312 sites report using this module. So that's the one I probably recommend, but check them all out for yourself. And what you'll see is that there's a couple of different ways that you can do this, either a one-time export, which I refer to as Drupal 7 retirement. You export it to HTML once, you shut down the Drupal 7 site completely forever, and you put that HTML export on your public web server. Or a periodic export, which I refer to as Drupal 7 suspended animation. So you're going to take your Drupal site offline. You may put it, it may exist only on a private subnet behind a firewall, potentially accessible only by a VPN, or it may not even be running on a server at all. And it only exists in a Git repo that you can spin it up in a Docker container in your local development environment using something like DDEV local or Doxel or Lando, which is probably my favorite of the three, or just, Docker Compose or whatever. And if you spin up your Drupal 7 site and make changes to it periodically, and then you use one of these modules or some other method to export the static HTML, and you put that on your public facing web server, then in some cases, maybe some of these organizations that just don't have the budget to convert hundreds of Drupal 7 sites to Drupal 9 within the next year that we have to do it, some of them are going to be keeping these Drupal 7 sites that are very seldom updated. They're going to archive them to static HTML, put them out there like that, and leave the Drupal 7 site. At least if it's no longer supported, it won't be directly exposed to the hostile public internet and all of the hackers. And I hesitate to even use the word hacker because, hackers, that can be cool. But, any of the malicious bad actors of the internet that are out there. So that's another way that you can do that. It's really only appropriate for sites that are seldom updated. It's a little bit too much of a pain to update content if you have to export it to static HTML every time. If you have to spin it up in a local environment, make changes, export it to static HTML, put that somewhere. If you've got a site that has a lot of content editors working on it all at once, this is not going to be appropriate for that. But you'll know if your site, maybe it's just a brochure where it's just got information about something that's probably not going to change. Or maybe it's for an event that's over, like the Drupal Camp New York City site. And once the event's over, it's not going to change anymore. You may as well archive that. Tips for static export. Now, I got all of these from this wonderful series of articles on lullabot.com, sending a Drupal site into retirement. So I'm not going to show you the entire thing. It's actually a series of 3 articles, but Lullabot has a lot of good content. And this is from 2014, but it's still relevant today, certainly for Drupal 7. If you want to export a site to a static site, you need to disable all dynamic features. There's no longer going to be any PHP sitting back there communicating with a database in the back end. No HTML is going to be generated dynamically. There won't really be any way to show different things to different users. Everything's going to look exactly the way it looks to an anonymous user. And in fact, you can't even really have users authenticate and log in to a static site. There's no such thing. So you need to disable all the dynamic features of your site before you export it to a static site. That means turn off Ajax, turn off comments, remove the login and user blocks, disable and remove all the forms, remove the search form and turn off the site search, switch to a non-JavaScript theme. I kind of scratched my head over that a little bit, but some JavaScript can be okay, but certainly Ajax that's going to be pulling things from a database and changing things on the fly, you can't have that. Turn on CSS and JS aggregation, which is going to take all of the wonderful tricks that Drupal does for optimization of libraries, right? It's like this JavaScript and CSS is only attached in this context. We're not even going to load it if it's not in this context. You can't do that anymore. It's all going to go away. We want to aggregate all the CSS and JS into just one big file, and we're going to include that as a static link from our HTML. And it's going to be the same on every page because that's how we're going to do it now. We don't have Drupal sitting there and deciding the context and whether or not a library is going to be attached. And once you've done all of that, review the site as an anonymous user. So make sure you're not logged in, or go to like a incognito tab or make sure you're not logged in and view the site and make sure nothing's broken that you want to see on the static version of the site. Some things are going to be broken and you're just going to have to get rid of them because there won't be a way to do it. Other things, certainly comments are on this list, but it's possible to have comments on a static site. They won't be the same comments that were in Drupal, but you could use a service, like discuss, DISQUS. It's a little JavaScript snippet you can include at the bottom of each of your pages that's going to allow people to leave comments on that. So it's possible. Read the article, read the series of articles if you're interested in static site. It's kind of old, but it's still relevant. In fact, static sites, right? That's about as Tim Berners-Lee as you can get on the web. That's very old school, and it hasn't changed that much. I mean, sure, HTML5, CSS3, yes, these things are new, but static sites haven't changed that much in 20, 25 years. So this is an old concept. It's okay to read the old article, and also to see this, this node on Drupal's documentation about how to create a static archive of a Drupal site. They talk about wget, same as I did. They talk about HTT track, same as I did. It looks like they even have information about advanced HTT track dumps and something called SiteSucker for OS X, which I didn't even look into. Way more information here. People also warning about disabling Ajax and all this stuff. So go and read that in the Drupal.org documentation. Again, static site, it's not for everybody. It's not always going to be useful. Now, rebuilding with a REST API is a little bit out of scope. It's necessary for decoupled or headless D7 sites. It may be possible to keep the existing decoupled front end if you've done like a React front end or something, but you'll still need to migrate the back end, and you'll need to implement the backend API. It's likely to be, even if you get to keep the front end the same and you don't need to do anything to your HTML and CSS that you implemented in React or Vue or Angular or something, this is still likely to be more complex than a straight migration, and therefore beyond the scope of this presentation. So I hoped to leave 15 minutes, but it looks like I've already gone over again. This is amazing. I gotta learn to get a little quicker, but here's my tips for migration. Again, this slide, all these things are linked. This is the Drupal.org documentation on upgrading Drupal, and all of these links go to different pages on the site. They tell you how to prepare a site for upgrade to Drupal 9. They give you some caveats that multilingual sites are more complicated. And in fact, I will show you that link because there's nothing on this page. What it actually links to is info about upgrading a multilingual Drupal 6 site to Drupal 9, and says that most of the same concepts apply to Drupal 7. Multilingual is hard. It's a lot more complicated, and there's a lot of information here. I got no more time to talk about it. All of these things are great. Documentation on Drupal.org that'll give you a lot more information than I'm able to give you now. And also, if you want to learn more about Migration API, the Migrate API in Drupal 8 and Drupal 9, check out Mauricio Dinarte's ebook, 31 Days of Drupal Migrations. This is also a little bit old now. It was from August 2019. It's a series of blog posts, one per day for that month. So there are 31 chapters, and it gives a really good overview of Migrate API, state of the art as it was then. They haven't really updated it since then, but the concepts are still the same, and that'll be a good thing for you guys to learn about. So that brings us to Q&A. And if anybody wants to unmute themselves and hit me with it now, I would be glad to answer any questions that you got. Let's see, we got someone named Fresh. Looks like they're unmuting themselves.
All right, well, he's waiting. I'm a little curious about the front end headless sites. It's a fascinating concept because in theory, you could even migrate from 7 to 9 slowly and having your React front end hitting both the sites as different elements become available. It's interesting. Has anyone actually ever in the wild seen a fully React front end totally treating Drupal as that headless entity versus like individual elements of a site?
I almost want to throw this open to just general discussion because I have not seen that in the wild. I'm not sure exactly how you would have like your decoupled front end hitting two different API endpoints and sort of regarding both of them as the ultimate source of truth. Although maybe you could migrate like some content to a secondary API endpoint and be like, I'm going to get my users from Drupal 9, but I'm still going to get my, it seems like you really don't want to do that because, and here's why, because when you actually, your content editors, right? If you don't want to move the users without the nodes because your users are going in there and editing the nodes in the new system, right? So you can't really have, I think maybe if you've got completely discrete and separate content types that don't really have a lot of overlap, you've got you've got your board of directors and you've got your events and they don't really like refer to each other, then I could see you moving the board of directors to Drupal 9 first, because it was a simple thing to migrate all these names and headshots and bios of all your board of directors, and then taking a little bit more time to migrate your events over. But I really think that like ultimately, if you've got that front end that you've got it listening to one API endpoint, you're just going to want to toggle that to listen to the new API endpoint and the new front end. This is how we do it anyway. When we build these things, we, you're not going to make these changes in your Drupal 7 production site. You're going to make a local development environment, make changes there. And in a decoupled site, you've got two different environments that you're going to want to make a copy of. You're going to have your Drupal 7 backend that you're migrating away from. And then you're going to have whatever your front end is, React or whatever it might be. Make a copy of that and tweak it so it listens to your new dev Drupal 9 site and start migrating the content over and see what the front end looks like. And when you get it perfect, you're going to take your production React site and flip it so it just listens to the new Drupal 9, I think, all at once. I would recommend that. It seems like I would be hard pressed to find a use case. You would know if your organization requires it, but I can't really think off the top of my head of any situation where it would be better to do that kind of incrementally rather than all at once. I would do it incrementally until it's ready and then take the production site and switch it all at once.
Yeah, it seems like you'd really want to try to make that move to 9 as fast as possible, just from the sheer shoulder weight of having to maintain the knowledge of all those different code bases at once. We didn't even talk about theming during this. There's just so many parts that trying to keep a small team focused on both entities sounds tough.
That is true that you mentioned that. I did not really focus on theming, because another thing that changed massively between Drupal 7 and 8 plus is that the old PHP, TPL.php files are replaced by Twig, and your theme is going to need to be completely rewritten, pretty much from the ground up. Some of the pre-processed functions might work the same way, but the templates themselves are going to be completely different. So I didn't even touch on that. Yeah. I just figure like that's just part of of scoping it and figuring out. I was thinking more about the contrib modules and the custom modules and the APIs that you're going to need to change, but themes are part of the projects that you're also going to find out if there's a new version of your theme. And then certainly if you've made a custom theme that's a sub theme of something else, all of your custom templates are going to go out the window. You're going to need to rewrite them from scratch.
I had a project walk about a month ago that was going to migrate from ASP to Drupal 9 and actually backed out over the theming layer.
Wow.
Like the weight of knowledge behind the gulps and the SCSS and all of those additional languages that they're going to have to internalize into their fairly small team finally made them just like turn around and walk. It was sort of a fascinating thing to watch.
And if that was their deal breaker, I would tell them you don't need to use gulp. I mean, a lot of front-end developers find it more convenient, but if you want to just edit the raw CSS files, go to town. You can certainly do that with Drupal. It's less efficient and less of in terms of the DX, right? The developer experience. I understand people maybe don't want to learn a new tool that's going to make their life easier because it's hard to learn something new. But I do think that the developer experience is better with if you're compiling SCSS into CSS. You can write the code in a simpler and more maintainable way. But if that was their deal breaker, I would say go ahead and upgrade it and just don't use gulp, right? Don't use SAS. Like, just use the, you can all the things that in a modern DevOps workflow that I consider to be like a build artifact that doesn't need to get committed to the Git repo. If the client's team balks at that, you can commit that entire build artifact to the repo. And if they don't want to, build it and compile SAS or whatever, they can just go and edit that CSS directly. And that's just going to be how they manage it from that day forward. They're going to be locked into that way, which to my mind is less efficient. But if that was the deal breaker, I would have counseled them that you don't need to use that. Is anybody else? I see a lot of people muted. So I see there are a lot of people here. Has anybody, like, maybe you don't have a question, but you want to talk about where your organization is at with Drupal 7, or what kind of a situation you're in? Are you able to, are you trying to decide now, what are you going to do in terms of upgrading? Are you going to go to Drupal 9? Or are you going to go straight to Backdrop? Or are you going to try to do something completely different, WordPress or some other thing, PHP .nuke or cake PHP or code igniter. We're going back in time now. But yeah, I definitely recommend going all the way to Drupal 9 if you can afford it, because you may be surprised that like things that you think are going to be that are going to avoid the pain of that, they might be just as heavy of a lift ultimately. Anybody else? It's been an hour and 15 minutes. I was gonna have 15 minutes if I stopped back at the 3:45. We've done 15 minutes of questions now. I will leave you with this slide if you don't have any more questions.
Hello.
Oh, you got one. Excellent.
Hello, yes. How are you?
I am well. How are you?
I'm good. Okay, I just have two questions. The first question is, I was doing just a research using Webalizer, and I see a lot of websites here. I'm based in South Africa. They're still on Drupal 7. So what is the effect of not upgrading from Windows 7? Because I'm seeing most of them, from the way I'm looking, they don't have any plan of upgrading. So what is the effect of not upgrading from Drupal 7 to Drupal 9?
Well, right now, you'd be more worried if you didn't upgrade from Drupal 8 to Drupal 9, because Drupal 8 did reach its end of life last month, and Drupal 7's end of life is extended for another year. So it's still fully supported as much as it ever was. So there really isn't any bad effect if you're still on Drupal 7 today. Ask me that question again in November of next year, and I will have a different answer, because the effect once it goes out of support is that it will no longer receive security updates from the Drupal security team. They will no longer be able to support it. The people that will be doing that instead will need to get paid to do it. You'll have to enter into a paid security contract for long-term support ongoing after end of life. And this is exactly the same as if you're using Wapalizer, as you say in your browser. If you stumble upon a site that is Drupal 6, then you would hope that they are in the long-term support program, because that's the only way that they're going to be able to keep their site updated. The main issue being security updates, although I think that some security updates in the Drupal 6 long-term support program may be available free of charge to the general public if you're still on Drupal 6, but it's more that they have to charge you for custom work that's for like your business. I'm not sure. You would talk to one of those vendors about that stuff. But essentially, yeah, like right now, there is no downside to still being on Drupal 7, except for you better be making a plan this year to deal with it, right? Because at the end of this year, after in 11 months, you will go off that cliff. We've seen it coming for a long time. They warned us, since 2018 was when they announced it, September 2018. That's 19, 20, 21. Okay, it's going to be 4 years since they announced it was going to be end of life. There's plenty of time for us to scramble and find our lifeboats. And hopefully everybody's going to be doing so this year, just as I've seen a massive effort, and I've been involved personally in multiple Drupal 8 to 9 upgrades. That is definitely, I've seen that effort happen for Drupal 8 as it reached its end of life, and I anticipate that this is the year that everybody's going to be migrating off of Drupal 7 as much as they possibly can. And in some cases, they're going to be migrating to Drupal 9, which is a big rebuild and migrate process. And in some cases, they're only going to be able to just make a static site archive and throw it up there. The advantage to that is nobody can hack a static site, So yeah, I hope that answers your question. There's no downside yet, but there will be in 11 months.
Yes, I'm answered 100%.
And you did say you had two questions.
Yeah, but you managed to answer both questions once because I did get the point.
That's good.
Yeah, it was very interesting. I did learn quite a lot on this session, especially with migration tools, because I didn't have any idea, but from this presentation, now I know the migration from D7 to D9 with those tools you showed us in the roadmap. Thank you for that.
Yes, you're welcome. Thank you. Thank everyone for attending. If anybody else has any other questions, I'll stick around for a couple more minutes. I see some of my friends. It's good to see you. I see Jamie Valentine. I see. I just saw Darren. Oh, he just left. Anyway, I think people are starting to sign off. So yeah, if anybody has any other questions, I mean, we're here. Certainly you don't need to ask right now during the lunch and learn, or if you're watching this in the future because you watch it on the YouTube, the Esteemed channel on YouTube, and you watch the video later, you couldn't ask me the question because it's in the past. So come to Esteemed. You can find us through esteemed.io. We're on Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, LinkedIn, and all of our videos end up on our YouTube channel. And we're here to help you navigate your options and decide what you want to do going forward as Drupal 7 eases off that cliff and into its eventual end of life.